Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we got author Don Hollway and his book, Battle for the Island Kingdom, England's Destiny, 1000 to 1066. Love this book. If you don't know this time period in history in England, it's insane. People were getting murdered left and right. Just absolute insanity. You couldn't trust anybody. You were getting stabbed in the back, both literally and figuratively. Somehow Don makes it all make sense in his book. I was so excited to talk to him, and I was not disappointed at all. So I'm not going to make you wait any longer. Let's get to it real quick beforehand, though. Right around the time this podcast is coming out, paperback copy of Don's other book, At the Gates of Rome, is coming out. So when you're picking up Battle for the Island Kingdom, make sure you get At the Gates of Rome, too. All right, now I'll shut up. And here we are with author Don Hollway and his book, Battle for the Island Kingdom, England's Destiny, 1000 to 1066. Don, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Now, Don, I know we're doing this only sound, but I do have to give you the award right now for the author with the best facial hair.
I think my wife would disagree. You should see when I go out reenacting, and it's a little trimmed, a little short right now, but when I put the handlebars on it.
Well, I'm telling everybody, go Google Don's name. It's the first picture. You're going to love it. Well, you just mentioned reenacting. I mean, just go into your website, right? You're an author, illustrator, historian, musician, fencer, reenactor. Which one are you best at, and which one is the most fun?
Well, let's just make it clear that I'm mediocre at most of those, okay? I dabble in most of those. I mean, I like to think that I'm best at being a writer. I've been doing that since the 90s, writing for magazines and everything else, and I've put a lot of effort into that. And I think I was probably born for that. I mean, I remember being in elementary school writing stories already then. I think it's something that's born in you or something like that. But I do dabble in some of the other stuff. Pretty mediocre illustrator. I do airplanes better than I do people. So I've done some magazine spreads and everything, but it's always a big airplane and the people are real little and indistinct. So that doesn't mess with the painting too bad. As far as musician, I play guitar. But I have a T-shirt that says, I play guitar because I like it, not because I'm good at it. And that's exactly true in my case. But I think, as far as the fencing, I think that is, some of the more fun stuff that I do. That sort of ties into the reenacting. I got into fencing, probably 10, 15 years ago as a foil fencer, which is the guys that you see in the Olympics that wear the white with the wire mask and everything and the little needle-like sword, and they're just out there tapping each other. Well, I got into it because that was as close as I could get, but eventually I found some people who were interested in rapier fencing. Rapier is like a Three Musketeers sword. It's a lot longer, a lot heavier, a lot stiffer. And that's what we use in 17th century reenacting. And that's a whole different ball of wax. It's not like what you see in a Three Musketeers movie where there's running up and down stairs and swinging from chandeliers and everything. Basically, two rapier fighters will go into a stance in front of each other and just freeze and each wait for the other guy to make a mistake to just give an opening. And then you move forward and stab him. And that's basically it. That wouldn't translate well to film, but it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do. And actually, I think I've gotten pretty good at that. My fencing master, I've got to the point lately where I could probably beat him 1 out of 3. And when I go to reenacting events, I'll take on anybody at those things. I flatter myself that I'm pretty good at it by now.
So basically, don't try and fight you in a bar because you might just smash a beer bottle and it's on.
If I don't have my rapier with me, you can do whatever you want with me.
All right, so Don, I love the book, Battle for the Island Kingdom. And one of the reasons I loved it, I said to you before we hit record, this part of history, which you got 1000 to 1066 and all that, it's a lot of times skipped over because it's just, for what is the clinical term? Chaos. Like, it's chaos. What made you decide that you wanted to focus on this mess?
Well, I'm not going to kid you. My first book, The Last Viking, was Osprey's bestseller for 2021, and it only came out in September. So just by the last quarter of the year, it outsold all their other books. So I'm not going to lie. Osprey was like, what else can you do for us on Vikings? So I already had the second book in the works, a book about the fall of Rome. So I was already working on that. But by the time we had that wrapped up, the new series, Vikings Valhalla, was due to come on. And we thought that would be a perfect tie into that. And I kind of wanted to wait and see what that TV show was going to be like. And it's entertainment, but it's certainly not a documentary. I'm not a big fan of the TV show. So if you like Vikings Valhalla, but you want to read the true story, Battle for the Island Kingdom is the book for you.
And just as I'm looking at it too, you have 1000 to 1066. Why did you start at 1000, or is it just OCD? You had to start with a round number.
Well, I had to start someplace, and I mean, the year 1000 is the turn of the millennium, and you're already seeing the Viking Age starting to wind down a little bit, and it's also 10,000. I wanted it to be, because the Normans figure big at the end of the story, and at the beginning of the story, they're almost an afterthought. I mean, they're just this little piece of France over there, and the Normans are descendants of Vikings, but they're really not a threat to anybody. Mostly what they're doing is providing a place for the Vikings who are looting England to bring their loot across the channel and sell it over there. And I just thought that would be a good place to begin it. In 10,001, 10,002, it's a little bit inexact. King Aethelred of England is said to have sent a raiding party over there to try and break up that market for the Vikings. He figured if he couldn't stop the Vikings, he'd at least make sure that they couldn't sell their goods over there in Normandy. And I thought that it's almost like an inverse of the Norman invasion, where you have Anglo-Saxons crossing the channel to invade Normandy. I just thought that's the place to begin the book, with the Anglo-Saxons invading Normandy, and then ended up with the Normans invading, having completely changed the power structure and coming back across to finish the job on England.
Now, I will say he's only kind of mentioned in this book because he's outside of this time frame. But as I'm reading this, it made me even more appreciate one of my favorite people from history, Alfred the Great. Mm-hmm. Because you think about how all of these people kind of couldn't pull it all together the way he did for the first time. And, some of these are his descendants. And it's just kind of like, well, I guess the apple sometimes can fall a little far from the tree. Right. Yeah, what you said there about pulling it all together. I mean, he was the first one back in his day. The Anglo-Saxons weren't even really one people. You had the Mercians, the people in Wessex, the East Saxons over in Essex, and they all didn't really get along. I mean, they were separate kingdoms. And of course, he had the Vikings putting pressure on them from behind. But I mean, he took advantage of the situation and said, look, we are not going to beat these Danes if we don't unite as one people and push them back into the sea. They didn't quite push them back into the sea, but in effect, that's what they did. I mean, they united against the Danes, who basically at that point were ruling half of England, the Danelaw, and managed to subdue them. Their last king, was it Eric Bloodaxe? I might be wrong about that. But he was either killed or murdered. We're not really sure. And at that point, the Viking Age in England at that point looked like it was over. I think that was actually past Alfred's time, but the work that he had done to unite the Anglo-Saxons lived on after him. Now, Alfred the Great, we jump to having a really cool name to the beginning of this book starts with Aethelred the Unready.
Right.
Which, that's not a great moniker. That's not one you want. Now, first of all, I will say I know there's multiple different translations, but tell me a little bit about our first king in this book.
Well, Aethelred, he was called Unready, which most people now translate as unready, which in retrospect is pretty well true, but that was not the exact meaning of it back then. It was more like a pun on his name. His name, Aethelred, actually means nobly advised. So they gave him the nickname Unready, which means ill-advised, but nobody called him that to his face while he was alive because he would have killed him. They think that wasn't really applied to him until decades after his death. But it's very apt. I mean, he was very poorly advised. If there was a traitor around or somebody who could not be trusted, Ethelred would listen to whatever he had to say and usually act on it. And I mean, that was really the root of the whole problem. He was like the polar opposite of Alfred the Great. It got to the point where all the Anglo-Saxons didn't trust each other anymore. They didn't want to fight for each other anymore. And basically just because Ethelred was such a poor king.
And I mean, he ruled for kind of a long time, especially when you compare it to some of the people after him. Was he somebody that from the beginning he just did not get it? Or was it something that you see with a lot of kings, they might start strong, but longevity is where they kind of get into trouble?
In Ethelred's case, it was not assumed that he was going to take the throne in the first place. When he was still a teenager, his older half-brother was actually on the throne. But Ethelred's mother, who was not the mother of that king, saw to it that he was assassinated. And of course, I don't think Ethelred had anything to do with it, but he profited with it. He was supposed to be very grief-stricken and everything and cried about it. and his mother supposedly beat him with a candle. I mean, don't think of one of those little taper candles that you see in church. Think of one of those big beeswax candles that's as thick as your arm, and it doesn't bend. It's a club. And supposedly he was afraid of candles for the rest of his life. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I heard. I think he was unprepared to be a king, and I think he was probably personally not likable. I mean, it seems like Dunstan, the archbishop, was kind of against him from the beginning because of this. When Aethelred was baptized, he was said to have defecated in the baptismal water, and the archbishop held that against him for the rest of his life. And it just sort of went downhill from there. Like you said, he had one of the longest reigns of, I think the longest reign of any Anglo-Saxon king. It was like 37 years, but it was just constant fighting with the Vikings. I mean, or buying them off with the Danegeld, the kind of ransom money. The Vikings would come down and say, we're going to lay waste to the kingdom if you don't pay us off. So he would pay them off. And the next year they'd come down and make the same threat again. And if he didn't pay them, they did lay waste to the kingdom. So he was really kind of up against it his whole reign. I don't think you can fault him for the way he handled the Vikings, because the Vikings were doing the same thing in France and Russia and basically anywhere they went. And a lot of people tried to buy him off, but you can't buy off a blackmailer. He's always going to come back and, take it from you again.
And I mean, to be fair, too, Alfred bought off the Vikings at least once, if not a couple of times. So, yeah. I mean, that was basically what you had to do. Now, there's so many within here. It would be a 6-hour podcast, which I'd love, but I think people would turn it off. So I want to jump around a little bit and is there anybody from these line of people we'll call it anarchy, we'll call it chaos, anybody who has a reputation that as you were writing this, you said, you know what, I think this person's got a bad rap, and I think he was actually better or smarter than people give him credit for?
The top of that list has to be King Harold II of England, Harold Godwinson. He got a lot of bad press because he was ultimately one of history's losers. They always say history is written by the winners. The winners were the Normans, and their writers just disparaged him ceaselessly in their writings after the time. They wrote him up as a breaker of oaths because he was supposed to have sworn to Duke William that he would give the kingdom to Duke William, and then when he did not do that, for very good reasons did not do that, the Normans latched onto that as an excuse to come over and launch their invasion. So I think he was very unfairly maligned for that. Looking back, even knowing how it would turn out, given the choice to do anything differently, I don't think he would have. He was more or less obligated to do the things that he did. And even for the short time that he reigned, even the Norman writers said he was a good king while he was on the seat. And if not for this fact that he betrayed Duke William, he would have made a good king. So I think Harold II, he was certainly a great military commander. I think he was very unfairly treated. I would say even his father, Earl Godwin, did not get the best treatment again. And that was even from some of the English writers. Godwin, he was an Anglo-Saxon who came up the hard way through the Viking ranks and actually served a couple different Viking kings. Served King Cnut, served his son Harold, and Harold's half-brother Harthacnut, served all them. And basically by adapting himself to the changing political situation, and some people could see that as having no principles. I think he looked at it as, you do that or die. I mean, these people are in power. You need to do what they say, make yourself valuable to them, and do what you have to do to get that done. And he did maybe some pretty reprehensible stuff, but I don't think that too many guys in his position would have done anything different.
Now, you did mention kings and seats, and it made me think, did you intend to have the grossest assassination of all time in your book, or did you just have to put it in there? You were just following the history.
What can I say? This is what they say happened. You're referring to Edmund Ironside, and he was Aethelred's son. And after Aethelred died, he and King Cnut, the Viking king at that time, basically just fought this running battle. I mean, up and down and back and forth across England. Neither one of them could gain an advantage, and they just ran roughshod over the English people. And it was getting to the point where, whoever wins this is going to be king of nothing because we've laid waste to the entire kingdom here. This was Cnut talking to Edmund. Why don't we rule as co-kings? You take everything in Wessex, everything basically south of the Thames and to the west, and I'll rule everything north of that, Cnut said, up into the Northlands. And Edmund thought that made a lot of sense. And I don't know that Cnut was necessarily being honest about that because Edmund did not stay on the throne very long. Well, he ended on the throne.
Literally and figuratively.
The story goes that the assassin waited for him in the pit beneath the outhouse seat and waited for Edmund to come in and take a seat. Now, I don't know how you would recognize the king when he put his butt down on the seat above you, but maybe the assumption is that he was the only one who would be using that seat. So the assassin was down there with a dagger and waited for somebody to sit down and stuck the dagger up in him. There's another story that they rigged a kind of crossbow with like a tripwire or a pressure trigger or something like that. So when Edmund sat down on it, it fired the arrow up into him and went so deep into him that nobody could tell that he had been hit. You know, that's a story. How much truth there is in that, I don't know. Personally, I don't think that's the worst assassination. If you go a couple hundred years after, I think 1340s or something like that, Edward II, who was the son of Edward Longshanks in the Braveheart movie. He was a lousy king. Turned out his people rose up and imprisoned him. He supposedly was assassinated by use of they shoved a pipe up his rectum and then slid a white-hot poker up through the inside of the pipe and stirred his insides around with it. When they pulled the poker out and the pipe out, nobody could tell anything was done. It looked like he died in his sleep. Well, you didn't have to wait in a full outhouse to do it, but these guys were creative. You had to give them points for creativity, right?
You give them something. I don't know what. I mean, probably they did not have enough therapists back then, clearly, the way these people are doing it. But I mean, especially Edmund Ironside, you don't want to think too much about how he ended, but he was someone that you really highlighted for me, that almost a missed opportunity, that there was a real good chance that he was going to be Alfred the Great level type ruler, because he seemed to start to bring it all together, but he didn't make it long.
Right. He was a lot more warlike than Aethelred and fought Cnut to a draw. Cnut had beaten Aethelred whenever they came together, but Edmund really stood him off. But again, fought him to a draw. Never really decisively beat Cnut, and that's what makes the difference. I mean, if Edmund had been able to defeat Cnut in the field and drive him off of England, then he could have taken the mantle of Alfred the Great, I think.
Now, to go completely to the other side of things, Edward the Confessor is just a completely different side of things. He becomes an actual saint. He has a little bit of a run here, but he overly complicated everything by basically being celibate, as far as we can tell, right?
Absolutely. He is the one who really is the root cause of all the events of 1066. He was Ethelred's son by Emma, who was a Norman duchess and then became the English queen. So when Ethelred was driven out of England, he took Edmund and his brother Alfred, or Edward, Edward, these names in this book, took them across to Normandy, and they were basically raised there from boyhood. So Edward was half Norman by blood. He was raised in Normandy. He considered himself Norman. And when he came back, he was invited to come back over by one of Cnut's sons, Arthur Cnut, who, although he was king of England by right of inheritance down from Cnut, really didn't want to be bothered with it. He was more into partying. And his mother was Emma, so Edward was his half-brother, invited Edward to come over and sort of handle the work of being a king. Well, Arthur Cnut died not too long after that, dropped over of either a stroke or was maybe poisoned. There's a lot of poisonings throughout this book. Poisoning was a lot more popular weapon than you think back in those days. So Edward, being Norman and, as you say, a celibate, nobody knows why that is. He married Earl Godwin's daughter, and whether they were both celibate out of religious reasons, if maybe one of them was infertile, or maybe he did not want to have children with her because she was Godwin's daughter. Godwin was not that popular with Edward. For whatever reason, he had no children by her. And in the 1050s, there was a bit of a revolution or a rebellion, and Earl Godwin and his son, Harold Godwinson, were forced out of England. And in the course of that time, while they were in exile, Edward invited William of Normandy, who by this time made himself Duke of Normandy. Edward invited him over and promised him the kingdom. He said, when I die, because Edward was a lot older, he said, when I die, I'm not going to have any children. I want you to have the kingdom. This was mid-1050s, I believe. And William was saying, okay, that's great. I have my dukedom. Now I'll have a kingdom. Well, William went back home. The Godwins had a resurgence, came back over and reasserted themselves. And for the rest of the reign, which was maybe 15 years, 10, 15 years, something like that, Earl Godwin subsequently died, and Harold Godwinson, his son, took his place. And when Edward died in January of 1066, Edward forgot or reneged on his promise to Duke William and said to Harold, you're effectively king already here. You are the most powerful man in England. Harold was probably more powerful and more popular than Edward at that point. And Edward said, you take the kingdom. It's yours. So Harold, obeyed his king's orders and accepted the throne. Well, Duke William over in Normandy hears that, sends messengers over and says, well, wait a minute. This is supposed to be mine. This was promised to me. Are you going to hand it over? And Harold's like, no, I'm not. And that's basically where it went downhill, because Duke William had fought his way up the ladder. I mean, the Normans were a pack of wolves. He was the biggest wolf in the pack and could not be seen to be shamed like that, to have his rights taken away as he saw it. And he decided that he was going to invade England and take Harold at his word and come take England from him. And a lot of the Normans thought that could not possibly be done. William's father, Robert, had actually tried it to take Edward the Confessor across the Channel in the 1030s, I want to say. And the Normans were, although they were descendants of Vikings, they had long since quit being good sailors. The whole fleet was blown off course, and they sort of gave up on it at that point. But Duke William decided, nope, I'm going over. I'm going to take England from this upstart Harold.
Just that answer alone, it's why your book is so good, because it's almost like 8 seasons of Game of Thrones in one book, because there are these strains, right, where you're talking about William, the Bastard, the Conqueror, whatever you want to call him, both awesome names. He's kind of in the background for a lot of this, and just all of these names, right? It's this person is this person's son, but their grandson, but it's their cousin. But oh, by the way, the lords are actually stronger than the king at this point.
Right.
And you have William the Conqueror in the back, like the big bad over the whole thing, where you just know sooner or later. And I mean, especially of all the people in the book, I think you do a great job with William the Bastard, then Conqueror, of showing just how he had to take his licks, and he was, since the cradle, he was trying to survive, and he learned how to do that. And it almost felt like, of course, we know what happened, but it was almost a fait accompli. If he set his sights on you, he'd taken down bigger and better. He was going to take you down.
Yeah, I mean, I make a point of that. He had such a hard life. I mean, his very life was in the balance in his childhood. When his father died and passed the dukedom to him, all the other barons in Normandy basically said, well, he's just a kid. Any one of us can, assert ourselves and take the dukedom. And at first they thought that whoever held William as more or less of a captive could just run the dukedom in his name. And eventually, when it turned out that William was becoming stronger and stronger as he grew into manhood, they decided, we can't do it that way. Somebody's going to have to kill him. They tried to do that multiple times. I mean, there was one scene where a killer broke into his bedroom where he and his one of his retainers were sleeping and killed the other guy. And William managed to get away. I mean, death was hot on his heels. There were multiple rebellions. He had to fight his own barons to subdue them. And once he had done that, his ally, the King of France, decided that Duke William, although William was the Duke to the King of France, so he was technically, lower down the rank, he was getting too powerful for his britches. So the King of France actually invaded Normandy a couple of times, and William defeated him every time. The beginning of the book, he hasn't even been born yet. But by the time he gets to the end, I think, at least I hope that I got it across how he was really forged into probably the top military man in Western Europe at that time. I mean, there was nothing he hadn't come up against.
I mean, listen, when you're the actual, vassal to a king and the king wants you dead and you don't end up dead, you're badass. There's no other way to say that historically. I'm not sure what the word would be.
Right, yeah. I don't know how you say that in Old French or Norman, le badass or something like.
So I want to take William the Conqueror off the table. I'm going to transport you back there. You're going to time travel. And I'm going to tell you can pick one of these kings. That one be your king, right? And I'm going to put you in the court, too. So you got to work for him on a day-to-day basis.
Sure.
You got to pick one. Which one are you going to pick?
I think I would go with King Cnut. I mean, they didn't call him Cnut the Great for nothing. I mean, he really earned that. He had a character arc in the story, as they say about novels and everything. When he was a kid, he was an out-and-out Viking. I mean, he didn't care anything about killing people. he had hostages on the beach at Sandwich, and he just wanted to make an example out of them. So cut their noses off and castrated some of them and then sent them home just to demonstrate what a labadas he was. That was him as a young man. And then when he struck that bargain with Ironside, and then Ironside was killed, and that was probably Cnut's doing as well, him still being a Viking. But eventually you see him, when he attains power and is king in England, all the other powers in Europe take notice of him. And he gets invited actually to the wedding of the Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, because he is now, although he's a quote-unquote barbarian, he is a leader of a large nation. I mean, England is nothing to be sneezed at over there. And he comes over to Rome and sees the ruins of the Eternal City and sees how the Holy Roman Emperor conducts himself and uses religion as a political tool. And I think it struck me that Cnut really grew up on that trip. The day of the coronation, he wrote a letter home to the English people, basically saying, you know, I may have not been a good king to this point, but I'm going to be a good king. And it seems to me that he had an epiphany at that moment. And after that, you don't see him slaughtering his enemies. You see him defeating his enemies, but being merciful. Well, he didn't really get the chance to go up against Olaf of Norway, but they think that he went over into Sweden and conquered over there and did not kill anybody. He went up to Scotland. That kingdom was rising up. And he basically struck a bargain with them and said, look, you can rule here as my vassal, and we don't have to go to war. Just take the knee to me. And most people were smart enough to do that. And after that, England really had, a decade and a half or so of peace. I mean, he proved to be a wise and a religious and peaceful king. And I think he was the best king in the story.
I think I would choose Aethelred because I think I can talk him into making me king. If you really tried, got him really drunk, I think I can get him to do it.
There were people who were interested in doing that, believe me.
All right, so different question. If you could go back and interview one person from your book, they have to tell you the truth, right? They can't hide behind anything. If you could get an actual interview with one person from the book, who would it be?
Probably Harold Godwinson. I mean, he is to me, particularly when at the end of the book, the climactic year of 1066, the year of three battles, he is the one that everything hinged on. And you can say the Normans said that he was an oath breaker and a terrible king, but a poor king could not have done what he did in that year, where he basically marshaled the entire English army, had them waiting all summer for the Norman invasion, which never came, let them go because the fall was coming on, the autumn was coming on, they had to go home for the harvest. At that point, the Vikings invade in the north, 200 some miles away. And basically on the fly, Harold Godwinson reassembled the army on the march, forced marched them up to Stamford Bridge in the north of England in a week or so. And to me, that's one of the greatest feats of military tactics ever. Few kings could have done that. You had to be a good king to do that. And then when he's up there and he defeats the Vikings, he's celebrating, everything's good. That was the biggest battle in England to that point against anybody. And then all of a sudden he hears that the wind changed direction in the south and the Normans came across. So he repeats the feat. He had already sent most of that army home from the north because they were decimated for one thing. Did it again, force marched everybody back down to the south. People argue that the men who managed to reach Hastings were worn out from all that marching. And that could be true, but they had a couple of days to recover. And I'm not really sure that had a lot to do with it. But the fact that they all followed him shows me that he was a good king. You wouldn't have followed a bad king to do that sort of thing.
Which I love too, and you just touch on it again. We've talked about how crazy everything was in England at this time. And then we talked a little bit about, northern France. We didn't even mention the fact that, oh, by the way, there's some people off to the east
right.
that every now and again might decide, let's go take England again. We took it before. We can take it again. And that's just kind of sitting there through this entire time period is we may look off, into the water and here come the Vikings again. Is that for everyone in England, especially at this time? Are they always just kind of waiting for that shoe to drop this entire time?
I think they thought that was mostly over with because once Cnut he really created what they call the North Sea Empire. I don't know if they called it that then, but now it's called the North Sea Empire, which was England and Denmark and Norway. He had either conquered or subdued at least all three of those and had, basically his empire completely around the North Sea up there. And that was part of the peaceful age that I was talking about. Once he did that, there really was no Viking threat because he was a Viking king. I mean, he was the Vikings at that point. So you really didn't have that Viking threat from across the water. Now, after he died, as always happens with these emperors, they die and the sons immediately tear everything apart. And the three parts of the empire kind of went their separate ways. And in the meantime, when all this was happening, a very minor character in the beginning of the book, Harold Hadrada, who I wrote about in my first book, The Last Viking, he really was a Viking's Viking. He had been all over the world, down in Constantinople as a mercenary, in Russia as a mercenary fighter. And he returns around 1046, 1047 to Norway. And he's so rich at that point that he basically buys half of that kingdom and immediately starts dueling with Svein, the king of Denmark. So again, the Viking threat, although it's not part of the North Sea Empire anymore, but the Vikings in Norway and the Vikings in Denmark are busier fighting each other than even thinking about going over to England, because they both know that as soon as one of them goes across the channel to England, the other one's going to step in and take his kingdom out from behind him. So they spend 15, 16 years basically fighting to a draw. And it's at 1066 that Harold of Norway finally reaches the conclusion he's never going to conquer Denmark. And Harold Godwinson's brother, Tostig, comes to him and says, well, if you can't take Denmark, why don't you come take England? My brother Harold's army is down in the south awaiting an invasion by the Normans. The north is wide open. Join me, come over here, and we'll take the north and we'll resurrect the Danelaw and maybe end up resurrecting the North Sea Empire again. And Harold Hadrada jumped on the opportunity.
Now, Don, I can't imagine that somebody isn't completely sold on this book yet, right? We've got war, we've got backstabbing, it's everything. There's everything in this. But there are some people out there who say, wait, this is a history book. History's boring. I took that class in high school. I'm done with it. If I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, why should I read Battle for the Island Kingdom, what would you say?
Because I didn't write a history textbook. I told a story. You had compared it to Game of Thrones, and I've compared it to Vikings Valhalla. The story is there, and I'm not just reeling off dates and places, and he did this and she did that. I'm trying to tell a story. I try to bring the reader into these characters' heads, why they did what they did, who was in love with who, all the various stories, regardless of how true some of them were, they're worth repeating. And that's what I'm doing. I through magazine writing for the last 20 years, you learn to write to entertain, to do that. I don't write for historical journals. I don't try to analyze, the last little obscure detail of an arrowhead that was dug up in a grave someplace or something like that. I'm in to tell the story of the people. And I try to write it like a novel. Like I say, not like a textbook. I'm telling a story.
Well, Don, it's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
I appreciate it.
And that's it for this episode, Don. Thank you so much for coming on. Battle for the Island Kingdom. It's really good, everybody. Go out and get it. I'd never lie to you. Hit us up, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget YouTube. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.